So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the first talk of Day 2 of ShmooCon, Hack the Planet Gently with a Code of Practice. So please give us a warm ShmooCon welcome for our first panel of the day.
Okay. Hi. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Jen Ellis, and I will be your compere today. No, that's a lie. I'll just be moderating this panel. Okay, so I'm Jen. I have worked extensively on what I would call researcher rights, I guess, for the past, 10-ish years. And I've worked with many of the people who are here on this panel around things like the DMCA and the CFAA. So that's who I am. I'm going to go down the panel and ask everyone to introduce themselves, and then we'll come back and we'll start talking about the topic, okay? So I'm going to hand off to my friend Casey.
Excellent. Good morning, everyone. Aside from sounding like Barry Manilow this morning, this is not my normal voice, but here we are at ShmooCon. My name's Casey Ellis. I'm the founder and chief strategy officer for BugCrowd. BugCrowd did not invent vulnerability disclosure programs or bug bounty programs, but we were the first to come out with this idea of basically building a platform to try to better connect all of the potential that exists in the hacker community with all the problems that we've got on the defensive side. So sorry, and you're welcome on that side of things. Also the co-founder of the Disclose.io project, and yeah, I think Jen summed it up well. This is a group of people that I've definitely been a part of for a number of years who've just been working to make the relationship between hackers and everyone else safer and more productive, and I think this talk's kind of reflective of elements of that, so great to be here.
And I'm Katie Masouras, founder and CEO of Luta Security, and we work with companies like Casey's to do end-to-end vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty management programs. But my history in this industry is about 25 years old, which is impossible because I'm only 25 years old. And I've been a hacker. I've been a strategist for Microsoft. I created Microsoft's very first bug bounties a decade ago. And I was helpful in creating Hack the Pentagon, the first bug bounty program of the US government. And I've also helped renegotiate things like export controls to allow for vulnerability disclosure. And I'm still an active hacker. A couple years ago, I hacked Clubhouse. I didn't mean to. My cat made me do it. But I tend to scribble outside the lines sometimes, and I think we all do. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Good morning. My name is Leonard Bailey. I'm Special Counsel for National Security and head of the Cybersecurity Unit in the Computer Crime and Intellectual Property section. Thank you. One thing I wanted to make clear at the outset, the topic we're discussing today, I'm here as a DOJ government official. The department is not advocating that there be code of conduct, accreditation, or any of the other things that might apply to creating norms of conduct in the hacker community. This is really the product of sort of a decade-long conversation that we've been having. And so just to clarify that, this should be just an interesting chat.
We're already in disclaimers.
Get ready for another disclaimer.
Oh, sorry, we've reached the lawyer part of the panel.
That's right, there's the lawyer end of the table. I'm Harley Geiger. I'm a cybersecurity attorney. This is not legal advice. That's my disclaimer. But I work for a law firm called Venable, and I've been working in the area of privacy and cybersecurity law and policy for about 15 years. In this particular part of cybersecurity, I've worked on hacking law, specialized in that for over 10 years. So I wrote Aaron's Law. I helped strengthen the DMCA Section 1201 protections and promote CVD all around the land. Thank you all for coming.
Awesome. So it's kind of a legit lineup on this panel. Okay, so why are we here? What are we talking about? Just quick show of hands, how many people in the room do security research or consider themselves to be security researchers? All right, so we're here for you. Again, as Casey said, you're welcome. So about 10 years ago, a researcher that I worked with a lot, who some of you may have heard of, his name is H.D. Moore. He got threatened with prosecution by a state prosecutor, and it didn't go anywhere. It's okay. But it took a toll on him, right? And if any of you guys, just out of interest, another quick show of hands, how many people have been threatened with legal action for research? Okay. I like the fact that it's a gray area and you're not quite sure. He was pretty sure. And it took a toll. And he was like, I don't really want to do research anymore. And then I became indignant. And an indignant Jen is a bad Jen. And I learned all about anti-hacking laws in the US. And I learned about the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is the main US anti-hacking law. And it's a little bit broken. And I learned about the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, DMCA. And I thought, wow, this is a bad scene for researchers, and we should try and do something about it. And fortunately, I was not alone in thinking this. There were some lovely other people who also felt the same way. And eventually, I met Leonard, and he then, brilliantly, he would come and meet regularly with the security community. He would talk to researchers. He's spoken at DEF CON and Black Hat, which for a man from the DOJ is a big deal, right? And he listened. I think this is the critical thing. He really listened to the community. And so the Department of Justice has done a few different things to kind of show support for researchers. I don't want to steal Leonard's thunder, so he'll talk about those in a little bit. But in May of 2022, while we were all trying to figure out whether we could go out and what the masking situation was, etc., the Department of Justice revised its guidance for charging violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And what they basically said is that federal prosecutors should not prosecute good faith security research, right? Now, some of you may have picked up on the fact that I'm a bit not American. And I've also been working in the past few years with my own government, the UK government. We have something called the Computer Misuse Act. It's similar to the CFAA, not quite the same, but similar. And equally, British researchers, are there any British researchers in the room? I'm guessing it's a big fat no, but just good to check? No, okay. British researchers also feel like the law is not particularly on their side and does not recognize the value of good faith research. So we've been having conversations with our government about that and looking at how that might change. And one of the questions that we get a lot, whether we're talking to the US government or the UK government or any other government, is how can we tell? How can we tell what is legitimate research and not something where people are doing nasty things and they're making an excuse that it's research, or they're stepping over a line even if they've got good intent? What's the sniff test look like, right? And it's potentially been pointed out a time or two that the security community is not known for its, how do I say this, conformity? Perhaps not even known for its alignment on topics. And so it's actually quite hard for people to say, here's a line, and we recognize that line, and you've told us that like anything on this side of the line is people being legit. And so, you know, one of the questions that's come up is, do we think that the security research community might ever create alignment of some kind around what decent norms, principles, practices, whatever word you want to use, look like for legit good faith research, right? We're not talking about regulation. We're not talking about something mandated. We're not talking even about a code of conduct. We're talking about something completely voluntary, but that people would look at and go, yeah, okay, I agree that that sounds like it probably is legit. And that would make it easier for people not in our community, not dealing with this every day, not buried in the nuance of it, to also kind of go, okay, that sounds like it's legit. So that's what we're here to discuss today. Whether it makes sense to have something like that, whether the community can ever actually come to agreement on something like that, whether there is harm to having something like that. To kick us off, I'm going to ask Harley to kind of give us a bit of an overview of what the legal landscape has looked like.
So the legal landscape for security research has improved a lot in the past 5 years, certainly from where we were 10 years ago or so. And Jen has already touched on some of this. So we have a couple of major anti-hacking laws in the United States, this Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and Section 1201 of the DMCA. I wish Section 1201 of the DMCA was easier to say, but that is a big one. Funny enough, in that weird copyright proceeding around Section 1201 of the DMCA is where a lot of cutting-edge conversations about what security research legal protection should look like. And over the course of 9 years or so, folks like EFF, myself, the Center for Democracy and Technology, Blake Reed, Andrea Matuition, and a bunch of other heroes were going to bat in this, Copyright Office hearing room to try to come up with what that protection standard should look like. Where we are now is it has been adopted for Section 1201 of the DMCA, meaning that you have an escape hatch from liability under that particular law for security research, if it's done in good faith.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Good job. And it took many hands. I want to say shout out also to Leonard Bailey and the Department of Justice for weighing in not once but more than once in favor of strengthening those protections. I mean, it's not something that they needed to do. They did it because they support the community. And following that, the Department of Justice then put out a charging policy, as Jen mentioned, for the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Before that charging policy, there was a great deal of fear around the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that it could be used to prosecute good faith security researchers because the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in some places does not distinguish between malicious intent and ethical hacking. The Department of Justice has made clear that they are not trying to go after ethical hacking, and they use that definition from the Section 1201 proceedings. Where we are now, though, is we're relying on sort of a vague code of vague understanding by the private sector. The CFAA charging policy the Department of Justice put out does not apply to private lawsuits under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It also does not apply to the states. So if you remember that whole episode not that long ago where the governor of Missouri was accusing a journalist of hacking the Department of Education, the Missouri state computer crime law is actually broader than the CFAA. And there is no charging policy, there is no security researcher protection. At the same time, the private sector is adopting coordinated vulnerability disclosure, which is wonderful. There's increasing adoption of bug bounties. I think the federal government has done an amazing job, actually, in leading the way. If you'll pick your favorite government agency and put that name plus vulnerability disclosure policy, and you'll find they have a vulnerability disclosure policy. They're ahead of the private sector on this. So adoption's increasing, but it's still spotty. I'm sure that other folks on the panel will have better statistics as to how far the adoption has gone, but still spotty. Overseas, I think less progress. There's, I think, more understanding kind of in a soft way about protecting good faith security research, but it is not yet codified. I will say one more thing, which is sort of, this is more on the cutting edge area of things, where other types of cybersecurity laws like incident reporting and security safeguard requirements are starting to build in this concept of good faith security research. So there is a major critical infrastructure incident reporting law. So if you have a cyber incident in your critical infrastructure, you have to report it to the federal government. But they've excised, they've made an exception saying if it's good faith security research, you don't have to report it because it's not an attack. But these are good things. I think overall the trend is moving in a very good direction, and it is to the credit of the community for organizing itself and standing up for itself and for doing good work that benefits the public.
Awesome. So then I think probably it makes sense to bring in DOJ and talk about what the department's history with researchers has been. I'm sure that everybody knows it's been a beautiful history, right?
We think. Let me back up just a touch to explain kind of where we came into the cybersecurity kind of landscape. Back in 2015, we started a cybersecurity unit to kind of harness what we were learning about prosecuting and investigating computer crime into prevention of computer crime. We did a number of things, a lot of outreach, a lot of briefings, presentations at B-Sides, Shmoo, DEF CON. But one thing that I think everyone thought was important was that we do concrete things and not just talk and meet. And so in 2016, we released our SCFA charging policy so people understood what our priorities were around charging offenses. In 2017, though, we produced a white paper that we released, which was a framework for vulnerability disclosure programs for online systems. And it's something released in June of 2017. We were kind of at sort of the vanguard of propping up the importance of VDP. And that document actually became something of a baseline It was used by, for example, CISA in creating their binding operational directive that applies to all federal governments and requires VDP. Since then, there are other things that happened, but in 2018, Jen came to us and said, are you aware that there's this thing, this triennial process every 3 years under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which is a statute that, among other things, makes it unlawful to circumvent technological measures that are used to protect copyrighted materials, think digital rights management, some encryption, region coding, things like that. Did you know that there was this triennial process and that there were exceptions that the Library of Congress would adopt where people identified what were non-infringing uses that would advance essentially the public good? No, we hadn't, I'm for the computer crime and intellectual property section, so of the intellectual property section side of the House, really hadn't been engaged in this process before. And they took a look at this. And what we found was that the computer security researcher exception that was created in 2015, in 2018 there was an effort to expand it. We actually thought there were some very good reasons to do so, because at bottom we actually do believe that computer security research can drive cybersecurity improvements. So, in that process, we ended up weighing in and publicly submitting a letter in support of most, not all, of the suggested changes that were in support of security research, and those were adopted. We kind of felt like our voice would kind of have an outsized impact because we are the component of the government that actually enforces criminally the DMCA.
It did. Oh. It wouldn't have happened without doing that.
We can't, we're not sure, but we hope that we had positive impact. So in 2021, again, came up, and there were also arguments for expanding it a bit further. And there are some things we didn't like in the 2018 proposals for expansion that we found actually were appropriate here. Something else happened, though, following all of that. In February of, in May of 2022, as Jen suggested, we had released what was a change in our charging policy. There had been, in 2021, a Supreme Court decision, in the case Van Buren versus United States, that narrowed the application of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. And contrary to positions we had taken before as a department, so we felt we had to provide guidance to our prosecutors across the country. We had about 300 that are trained specifically to do computer crime cases. So we sent out guidance to that community on that case. In the course of doing so, though, we also took the opportunity to make a pronouncement about charging security researchers. And what we said was essentially prosecutors should decline any prosecution of good faith cybersecurity or security research. Now, that begs the question, what is good faith security research, which is part of this discussion, but also the policy did identify something that was extracted from the DMCA and that process, and it essentially is accessing a computer solely for investigation, testing, or correction of a security flaw or vulnerability when it's done in a manner that does not cause harm to an individual or the public, and the information derived from that is used to protect a class of machines, devices, or online services. So that is the sort of the safe haven that's been created. And with that, I will stop.
Okay, so before we move on, and I just want to clarify one thing, because we're talking a lot about law enforcement, and it's really, that is a really important piece. But I'm guessing that for some of the people in the room who kind of said, well, maybe I've had legal threats, it might have been not from law enforcement, it might have come from the vendor world, the people you're actually disclosing to. In the US, the CFAA and the DMCA both contain civil causes of action. And so what we're looking at here, yes, we think it will potentially help around the law enforcement side, but we also believe that it could potentially help if you are in a situation where you're getting threatened by a company to kind of say, well, hang on a second, I've been following best practice. And I know everyone hates the term best practice. I should put like a TM in the back here and say I am a certified thought leader when I use that term. But still, for the purposes of defense attorneys, it's quite useful to be able to say, no, look, there is an industry-recognized way of doing things, and that's what we've been doing. So just to be clear that we're not just talking about law enforcement. All right, so with that, I will turn to Katie and Casey. I guess the first question, before we get into like, is it a good idea? Will it work? What could happen? Is, do the norms already exist? Do we already have them?
I'll Rochambeau you for it. Norms. Look, I think they do. I don't think they're codified into anything that could be, accurately described as a code of conduct or a code of practice. But the thing that I've seen happen and that we've had to really drive as a part of what we do, particularly with BugCrowd, is basically educating this kind of ballooning community in what's going to not cause the entire thing to catch on fire.
Right.
Like, I think on top of the legal changes and the different things that have happened in the policy environment to just make hacking safer and allow the internet's immune system to like do its thing. The other side of it is that I think hacking is better understood as inherently dual use now in a way that just wasn't true 10 years ago, right? Like 10 years ago, everyone thought it was bad. The first 3 or 4 years of BugCrowd was literally just going out and repeating over and over again that hackers are actually helpful, not just harmful. Hacking in itself is not actually, it doesn't have a moral loading. It's just a skill set that has an upswing and a backswing. So in the course of doing that, it really, seeing a whole bunch of new people come into this, people in this room that I know are very active in security research that weren't 10 years ago. There's also people that were. There's almost like these different generations of hackers that have kind of joined in over the past 10 years. And the thing that we've needed to do there is to basically help the whole thing not run off the rails. Because it's still, at the end of the day, it still is inherently scary to have someone come in from the outside world and tell you that your baby's ugly. At the very least, it's uncomfortable and awkward, right? If you're not, prepared for that as an organization, just on the tort side, forget about what the law says about it. That experience is an inherently confronting one. Katie's done a lot of talks about that side of it as well. So I do think the norms exist on, what is going to reduce the likelihood of misunderstanding in that process. Yep. And I think the community in general tends to educate each other on that. If they see someone kind of skipping outside the lines, they'll bop them on the head because they want to protect the herd.
Right.
It exists in an informal capacity, I guess is what I'm saying.
Okay,
So-
I know Katie's got.
Yeah, I've got a little, because I'm, a pink-haired old lady, and I have old lady memories of different attempts at this from the security community. How many of you remember a certain hacker by the name of Rainforest Puppy? Literally, okay, there's a handful in here. So Rainforest Puppy wrote a vulnerability disclosure policy called RF Policy, and he published a couple versions of it, but the one that we normally reference came out in 1999, and it originally gave sort of an outline of how he would conduct himself when it came to vulnerability disclosure to entities that he was doing research on, and how long he'd give them before he publicly disclosed technical details and possibly proof of concept code. The original RF policy actually only gave 5 days for a vendor to fix vulnerabilities before he went public. He was convinced by running it by a few friends that maybe 30 days was more fair, so it became 30 days. And that was actually the norm for a long time in terms of vulnerability disclosure. When I worked at Stake, one of the first AppSec companies that did application penetration testing and code review in the early 2000s, we adopted a similar policy. And when Stake was acquired by Symantec, we found that we were the only hackers working at Symantec at the time, a security company, and it was one of the biggest security companies at that time. And they had no policy, so I adapted the Stake policy, created Symantec Vulnerability Research, which you will all know the concept as something closer to Google Project Zero. That is where internal researchers to a company are doing security research and publishing their findings. But essentially, we've had all these different iterations of attempts at these norms, and in fact, the original vulnerability disclosure policies originated with hackers, not with organizations receiving vulnerability reports. So that may be, how many of you are surprised by that? It's original vuln disclosure policies came from hackers. So yeah, so there was always this attempt to say, we come in peace, mostly, unless you take too long, in which case we believe the best way to protect the internet and protect the users is to publish. And that's really the piece where everybody gets all tangled up. When I worked at Microsoft, in fact, we had online services, and in 2007, I published one line on Microsoft's security web pages that said, if you come gently at us, if you hack us gently with a code of practice, if you come at us and give us time to fix an online service vulnerability, we will not pursue legal action against you. It was one line, and it was the very first time a vendor had publicly said that they weren't going to, use those.
Cloud up and running.
Yeah, exactly. Use those, laws for good faith security researchers. And nobody really noticed, honestly. Actually, there was some reporter in the room when I gave a presentation on it that I thought was sort of a private presentation, and I used a colorful phrase that in Korean got translated to, if you report vulnerabilities to Microsoft responsibly, they will not call you a pervert. That is not what I said. But that taught me some things.
It's
anyway,
probably true, but it's not.
it was also true, but definitely not what I said. Lost in translation. But I guess the initial question is, has it been attempted before? Yes, piecemeal. Have we all agreed on it? Absolutely not. Are there researchers inside corporations that have to abide by some sort of code of practice? Yes. And do these corporations often disagree on what that should look like? Absolutely, yes.
So thank you, that was a great history. And you'll note that the panels have all been very polite and very kind to this point. But now I'm going to get into the big question. Can this work? Is it going to be beneficial? Fight. Who wants to go first? Oh, yeah, okay.
So I'll start by saying this. I'm something of an outsider to this community. But from the outside, I think I have a vantage point on certain issues. So first, if I'm a business and I am saying, please come find vulnerabilities on my system, if I'm not taking assurances that you're doing that in a manner that's not going to disrupt my business operations, result in the loss of personal information, otherwise, cause harm, I am facing a world of problems in a number of ways. And so how do I do that? I can do that on faith, or I could see some indicia or have some understanding of the way in which this discipline is actually engaged in. Separately from that, if I'm the government and I've got entities that are, let's say, critical infrastructure, and the disruption of those causes some danger to public health, safety, economic security, as a government, we have an obligation to try to make sure that those types of activities that might cause those harms are curbed. Now, I think you can do that at the same time as building out vulnerability disclosure programs by creating some sort of transparency and some sort of norms about the way in which these activities are conducted. And I think, in fact, there's a lot of pressure to do that. I mean, I think many of the current sort of VDP platforms that have hackers on retainer have contracts, and those contracts outline circumstances under which they will or won't operate, or how things are done in scope or out of scope. And I think those are actually the seed for this sort of understanding about how this practice is done. That suggests to me that there actually is something of a discipline that exists. There is some sort of understanding about how you do this in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary harms while you're discovering vulnerabilities and flaws. And the question is, how do you sort of flesh it out and make that better known so that people have greater confidence that they can allow people to do this sort of thing on their systems?
Yeah, I think with that, like, is it beneficial? Like, you touched on a really important point there, because this comes up a lot, and it has, pretty much the entire time over the course of the last 10 years. There is a distinction between crowdsourcing and basically vulnerability intake, and what I think of as disclosure management, right? Like crowdsourcing in terms of reaching out to the community and saying, we're coming to you and saying, would you like to do this thing? And as a part of initiating that conversation, being in a position where you can put parameters around it, that's a thing. That's not the same as, like, sometimes you're gonna have a bug in your stuff because people write code and people make mistakes, and sometimes lightning's gonna hit your house. So it's better to put up a lightning rod. I think, from a norm standpoint, just coming back to what you were saying before, one of the things that we did with Disclose.io, kind of building on top of the RF policy work and some of the stuff that Katie did as well, is just to basically get that safe harbor piece out there into the corporate space and say, hey, listen, like, you can't, using my lightning analogy before, you can't run out to the thunderstorm, yell at it, and expect it not to hit your house with lightning. Like, that's not how this works. If you're going out there and saying, from a legal standpoint, we don't like you, doing security research on our staff, and our ability to cloud up on and rain on you is actually going to prevent vulnerabilities in our systems. That's ostrich risk management. That's not how you actually create a safer environment, right? And I think trying to drive adoption of that and make that process easier and better understood, the more it's socialized, I think the more inertia those ideas get. I think that's something that I've seen be quite effective in that particular area over the past 10 years. And I think the same things can apply in terms of educating hackers on how to be better at getting the right information into the hands of people. We've seen folk come in, as newbies, they've watched, Tavis give a talk or seen kind of the full disclosure thing, and they just think it's how it's done. Yep. They don't necessarily understand the equities that are involved in making that decision. They just see it, they model it because they lack the context, right? And all of a sudden they're creating additional risk in the process. That's not to say full disclosure is a bad thing. I think it's kind of like death and taxes, right? But for a rookie, they've got to actually understand how mechanics like that work. So, I think to me, like, can it be beneficial? I think having a conversation around the fact that these are the things that we have to solve in this space in the first place, I think that's incredibly beneficial. I do also think that, this sort of thing can very easily get over its skis as well. So there's a bit of a balance there.
So, go ahead.
No,
No, go ahead.
No, I was going to go after you.
Oh,
okay.
God, you guys are so polite.
All right,
I said
so-
fight, damn it.
All right, I'll fight. The root of all bug evil is from vendors. That's who wrote the bugs. That's who's responsible for fixing them. That's who's responsible for responding to vulnerability reports or not. And they're the ones who cause all the friction in this arrangement. And I guess that's an unpopular opinion sometimes, and it definitely was when I worked for a vendor. But I've got to say that, some of the things that I find problematic about this ideal, it's an idea and an ideal, is that, one, if we look at saying, well, if your intent was to do this, then it's okay. Well, accidents happen. How many times have I used to live on a street with an apostrophe in the name. SQL injection, verbose SQL errors would just drop out of forms out of the sky. I would never had an intent to do any security research, but it kept happening, and it was very annoying. So would I have been protected under, norms that say you have to have this intent? I'm like, I'm just trying to fill out a form. I would just like my driver's license to be, renewed or something online. I didn't mean to hack the government. So there's an intent problem there where accidents do happen. And then there's another issue where, quite frankly, how many of you have ever just done a simple Nmap scan and knocked something over? Like it just went belly up. Yep, this happens a lot. Pay attention to this. This happens a lot. So the fact of the matter is, if you have that clause of as long as it causes no harm, well, let's get back to the principle of all bug evil is rooted in vendors making crappy products that can't stand up to even casual use, let alone security research. So I do have strong opinions about this. Am I willing to have the discussion about what norms could look like? Sure, But I also am faced with those really hard realities, those harsh truths, and the fact that, you know, we may not intend to set out to do security research, and it happens anyway. And we may encounter systems that aren't prepared for even the most rudimentary scanning and probing, and we weren't even targeting them necessarily, and we could cause real harm accidentally. And then finally, we've got all these vendors and government agencies and all these things where they've stood up a policy maybe at best, but they've got no real capacity to handle the bugs that you throw over the fence. And that is the problem that we still see today. That is going to be an ongoing problem, the long tail problem of vulnerability disclosure and bug bounty programs. And over to you.
Yeah, I think
Over to
so.
you.
Just
Yeah.
quickly on that, there is a reality to this, that the internet's way more broken than most people realize. Yeah, that's kind of really what it comes down to. Like the number of vulnerabilities that are out there. Yeah, even with what you're saying, Katie, I agree about Nmap scanning stuff and it falling over and that not being a good thing. But anyone who's done work on industrial control systems knows that you can drop safety critical infrastructure by doing that. So there's got to be. It's not to say that that's the hacker's fault necessarily when they do that, because ultimately it should be less shitty in the first place. But if you're taking a power plant offline, like, okay, someone's going to get called to the mat for that. So this idea of like, okay, how do we better understand, the problems that we're actually trying to solve here? Realistically, the vulnerabilities that we have aren't all going to be solved, I think, ever. Like we need to be thinking about this through a risk management lens, not a technical purity lens.
So I'm not going to take a firm stand for or against this norms or code of conduct because I have mixed feelings about it. And maybe that is reflective of many of you in the audience about whether this is a good idea. And when we say this, we are talking, I've heard it alternately described as norms, not a code of conduct, although code of conduct is in the title of this panel.
It's not code of
Never mind,
code
I'm
of
wrong,
practice.
code of practice. But hearing it described in different ways, I think there's a big pro in my mind and a big con in my mind, and I'll describe them. So the big pro is that it might, having a code of practice might increase trust, right, between security researchers and the subjects of their research, organizations that they are researching. If they are following this code of practice. And it might cause the community to self-regulate a little bit better by following the code of practice. I think that it is a lamentable thing that we have people who are doing things that we think of as outside the norm, claiming to be security researchers. We saw this with Paige Thompson not that long ago, where a tremendous amount of information was exfiltrated. There's evidence that she was trying to monetize that, and out of the gate claimed, no, this is good faith security research. At the same time, I think it's also lamentable that the security community will sometimes say, that what this person has been arrested for is not security research, but because they have done security research in the past, they should be protected, right? That, I think, is also unfortunate and starts to erode trust. We do have these legal protections that we've talked about, but they don't cover everything. Right, so Leonard described the definition of good faith security research. In that definition, which I won't rehash, but the idea of exfiltrating information is not in that definition of good faith security research, although it is there, as your safe harbor. So the question I think the security research community needs to ask is, what do we get out of it? And I think that your best chance is that it will increase your potential safe harbors, your potential for trust with organizations you're researching, and maybe better self-regulation as a community. Now the big con, right, the big drawback, which is we can say, stand up here and say that this is not going to be used in legal settings. It will be used in legal settings, 100%. Yeah. And it's not going to be at the principles level either. Right? So if you come up with a set of principles for security research, there's going to have to be, in order to be accurate and protect security research in practice, it's going to look more and more like a legal document. There's going to be, well, you can't exfiltrate data unless. Don't go full disclosure unless. And there'll be different factors. I know because I have written things like exceptions to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It's going to get increasingly complicated. And it will ultimately be more restrictive than the status quo. That could be a feature or a bug, depending on how you look at it. But people like me, lawyers like myself, will use that, in cases like Paige Thompson, we'll say like, well, no, that clearly wasn't security research because, it's outside of the norms. I've already used things like that in legal settings. Now the con, though, if you were at my talk yesterday, the Security Research Legal Defense Fund, which I coordinate, we use the definition in law for good faith security research. If there is a code of practice that is generally understood to be what good faith security research is, it is likely going to be more restrictive. There will be some pressure on entities like the Defense Fund to say, well, we're not just using the legal definition, we're using the code of practice. So it will be more restrictive. To my mind, big pro, big drawback.
So I guess taking that as a kind of a launching point, I think that's probably right. It would be more restrictive. There are some questions as to what form this would take, right? There are things that are more general principles, do no harm, things that are more specific. Here's how you will do that. I don't see this taking the form of a statute that would outline, with every tick exactly how you would do something, but rather much more like what you see in other industries. And on the what will you get out of it, I think there are a couple things there. So with maturation, I think you see in different industries things like a code of conduct forming. And whether it's law, medicine, engineering, science, there are codes of conduct about how you do research. And this is, again, I think part of the maturation of the industry. The benefits to the individual, I think, are a fewfold. The first is they can protect you, these codes. So if it's properly done, and you're absolutely right, there are accidents, and I think you'd have to recognize that, but if the notion is, if you follow these steps and bad things happen, that's internal to the code of conduct. That should take that into account, that accidents will occur, as long as you follow these steps that are intended to do things like minimize the disclosure of private information or cause undue damage to a system. If you are following steps that are intended to avoid that and mistakes are made, in other areas and other programs, that's taken into account. The other thing I think, for me as someone who enforces the law, is somewhat important here is the education component that people kind of, I think, alluded to earlier. There is something, well, first I divide what we're talking about here in kind of VDP between discovery of vulnerabilities and disclosure of vulnerabilities. The discovery portion is kind of the computer fraud and abuse and accessing systems. The disclosure is other stuff, which includes potentially extortion. And the reason I want to touch on that is because with the advent of bug bounties, there's been what I've seen as a shift in some of the practice, where individuals who find vulnerabilities and flaws may feel entitled to compensation for that. And that means that they may be contacting entities, for example, that haven't invited them in, they don't have a VDP, and there's this discussion that occurs with this person who has no reason to understand why you're on their system and is opposed to that, that results in a referral to us. And I can say that we've had more than one referral of this sort. We have backed some of those out with an understanding of exactly what was happening there. But there are clumsy conversations that are happening that do stumble into problematic areas.
And it's Casey's fault. That's what you're saying.
That is 100.
Right?
That is 110% a thing too. And it's oftentimes, to your point, it's oftentimes people that are coming in again without context. Their view is, okay, this vulnerability data has attached value to it. I should be able to recover that attached value. Which, when you think about it, that's a pretty rational kind of thought process on their side. What they don't realize is that if you're getting initial contact from someone for the first time, you don't have any of this stuff proactively published, and it's like, oh, I can hack your stuff, by the way, you should pay me for it. That feels kind of like extortion, and you're going to have a bad day.
Yeah, and that's just an area where I think, for example, concretely, norms and having folks who are in this 100%. Industry understand how you do that would be very important, and keep hackers out of the crosshairs.
We're coming towards the end of our time, and I'm hoping that we might have time for a question. So if you have a question, go stand up on the microphone. But I'm going to abuse my role as moderator and give my 2 cents on this and try and pull some of these threads together. So I'll start with sort of picking up on some of Katie's themes. I agree with Katie that the vendors are largely the ones in the hot seat on these kinds of issues. And I think that we probably all agree that we should not be moving responsibility away from them and onto researchers. And in fact, if we did, it wouldn't work because ultimately the researcher isn't going to fix the problem, the vendor has to. I think the thing to understand here is that a proposal around some understanding of norms and some alignment behind norms isn't about moving that responsibility. And in fact, if you look at the legislative landscape, more and more governments around the world are recognizing the importance of vendors taking better action. We are starting to see requirements for secure by design and secure by default. We're starting to see requirements for VDPs and for vendors to report vulnerabilities. And so there is a really big shift in policy circles around vendors being required to take responsibility. This isn't about moving the responsibility on researchers. This is about protecting researchers and making researchers giving researchers a better position to kind of have, as Casey said, the idea of where are you coming from on this. And then I also want to pick up on, I really liked the point around, you know, this sort of idea of we don't want to be regulated. Policymakers, that's kind of where they go, you know, regulation's sort of their thing. And part of the problem is that security is seen as a young industry. It is a young industry. We are just coming out of our first generation, if you will. And a lot of focus is going into the idea of professionalization of security, this idea that we'll have to be certified to do certain jobs and that kind of thing. I don't want researcher to be one of those jobs that has to be certified. And we're much more likely to avoid somebody handing certification to us, handing regulation to us, if we're perceived as being self-organizing and self-governing, I guess, is probably the wrong word, but like that idea that we've decided for ourselves and that we've created some level of alignment and conformity. Right, I could talk about this for a long time, you probably gathered that. I'm gonna shut up and
Jen, I got to say, though, that's probably the best argument I've heard, is that if we don't do this ourselves, they're going to do it for us. Yeah. And honestly, it's you might have changed my mind right now, live streaming.
I am the champion.
Because, and I will say this, back to the root of all bug evil, that is the way the software industry has avoided software liability, is they self-police themselves. They self-started publishing what they're doing to be secure and what they're doing to be responsible stewards of technology. You got me, Jen. You got me. Surprised.
So
I'm surprised.
Have we got time for today, one question?
I just want to say, however it's written, make sure that it's something that you'd be comfortable seeing in regulation. Just make sure it's something you're comfortable seeing in regulation. The software industry has avoided liability in part because of their terms of service and their shrink wrap contracts.
Because of their lawyers, yes, they have avoided it.
But it's going to happen where that code of practice, you know, somebody's going to introduce it in the triennial process of the DMCA, saying, you know, we need to modify our definition of good faith security research to fit this code of practice now that it's established. So be careful to make sure that it's something that the community wants.
All right. Do we still have time for one question? One. Okay. Is that Winona? Hi.
Hey, so you guys have talked a little bit about how we should self-regulate, and so when we're going back to the communications between a hacker and a vendor, especially one that doesn't have a proactively published VDP, how would you, as BugCrowd or your experience at DOJ, or as potentially somebody's future lawyer, how would you recommend that a hacker who hasn't had experience with this before draft their comms initially to reach out?
All right, who wants to jump in? We've got to be quick because we've got to get out of here.
I think there's an opportunity for norms around that communication side of things. I think in general, our advice is respect is key. I think honestly, if there's a baseline understanding that empathy in both directions is actually the thing that's most likely a predictor of success, and that's the starting point, then you cover a lot of ground just with that recommendation there.
My usual approach with vendors that I don't see a published VDP is I say upfront that I'm trying to disclose a vulnerability. Are you the right contact? I point to the ISO standards on vulnerability disclosure and vulnerability handling processes that I'm the co-author of, but I point to them and say, this is the process I'm hoping you're following just secretly with no published anything. And then if I don't hear back, I start escalating. The policy itself, the ISO standards themselves have suggestions on points of contact to try if you don't see anything published. So, you know, if folks haven't seen, I have a 20-minute YouTube video out that's been out for a decade now on the VDPs, you know, the ISO standards, but essentially saying, I come in peace, I'm trying to report a vulnerability, point to standards that that vendor should be following, ideally, and then escalate as necessary. You know, if you want to avoid legal action, definitely talk to a lawyer, but, you know, that's generally my approach when I see people with no VDP.
Okay, so we're at time, so I'm going to say thank you to our amazing panel, and thank you to our amazing audience. As I said, lots of experience and smarts here. We'll be heading out of here and we'll be around, so if you guys want to talk about this more, it's a big topic, please follow us out. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did you give me